2019 is the year I pledged to play through the Castlevania franchise and record my journey through these vlogs, culminating in one big video review at the end. Now, closing off the 90s with entry 12, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. Welcome back to another entry into the Castlevania Diaries. We are coming into the end of 2019 and I am nowhere near completing this series because it is so massive. So Castlevania, we've got almost 30 games to go through and I'm around the 10 range, so this is going to go well into 2020. But anyways, today we're going to be talking about probably one of the most difficult games to talk about in this series, which is Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, the second game which came out for the Nintendo 64. And the only reason I say that it's difficult to talk about, specifically coming off of a Castlevania 64 Castlevania Diary, because the two games are very similar. In fact, many refer to Legacy of Darkness as the remaster, the ultimate edition of Castlevania 64. And this is back in the day when remasters weren't really a thing. Like back then you couldn't patch a game, you couldn't update it. It wasn't very common yet to take a game and port it to a new platform. But in the case of Legacy of Darkness, this is a game that came out, I believe it was 6 months, a couple months, it's almost the same year, less than a year after Castlevania 64, included everything you had in Castlevania 64, but added 2 more characters with their own stories, their own combat mechanics, and a few more levels. So this really is the complete package of what there is to experience on Castlevania for the Nintendo 64 platform. And there's good and bad to be talking about this game coming off of Castlevania 64. So first of all, I'm not getting that 20-year design shock. So if you're in if you're in the present pretty much playing an old 3D platformer like anything on the N64, it's rough. The controls are really rough. They weren't mature. This was new to designers, programmers, everything. So playing an old 3D platformer game like this, especially the first in a franchise, it's going to hurt. And because I spent so much time playing Castlevania 64, transitioning to Legacy of Darkness was a lot smoother for me. I kind of had the controls down. I kind of knew what to expect from the accuracy of my controls. So platforming in Legacy of Darkness just felt better. Now, maybe they did tighten the controls. I can't prove that they did. I think it's just my own skill level of being more accustomed to that era of 3D platforming that I just played better. Everything about this game is just better. I don't really have anything very memorable to share with the game other than, you play as a werewolf, which is cool. I did miss the whole whip mechanic, and especially I missed the orb mechanic of the character I was playing with Castlevania 64. But the weird, hyper punch with an energy beam at the end, which is what your main character does in this game, was pretty okay. I thought this was how in fact, I played Legacy of Darkness first before Castlevania 64, and I thought that was how they got around the whip mechanic, because I thought that they couldn't get the whip working in 3D, but then, of course, they did, because that's what you play in Castlevania 64. They got rid of a lot of things that were very annoying in the first iteration. For example, the whole mixing the potions halfway into the game in Castlevania 64, where you can't jump or can't get touched or you blow up. That level's gone in this one. They're just like, nope. So everything about the levels there, it's early 3D platforming. It's nothing really memorable. Honestly, I think if you remastered this game, it could be really interesting with tighter mechanics and just exploring a castle. This would be a game that you could do a lot with a port. Not a port, a remaster. But for what it is, it's good. It's not bad. I know that the 64 era Castlevania game gets a lot of hate, and I'm glad I played them, because now that I'm fresh off of those games and I've had time to let them stew, they're not that bad. I know when I was playing them, I was definitely frustrated, especially getting into Legacy of Darkness after Castlevania 64, which I found so frustrating. I just wanted to go right through Legacy of Darkness and move on, which is another kind of, I'm a little bit biased because of that, because Castlevania 64 spoiled the pot. I think Legacy of Darkness came across as both better and worse. Better because I was better with the controls, worse because I'm like, I've had enough 3D old school Castlevania. But at the time, I can imagine if I was playing this back in 1999, this game was a massive like value package. You had a game with 4 different stories that with each of their own levels. It plays decently well for what it is at its time. The bosses, which is something I'm always hating on in these retro Castlevania games, the bosses are probably what I enjoyed the most in Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. They're difficult enough to go like, oh, am I gonna like, oh shit, I'm gonna die, but they're also easy enough that the challenge just feels just right. When I'm playing the bosses, it's exciting because it's a boss, the music's more intense, and they've all got their own unique mechanics to it, and it feels good to defeat them, but they're not unfair or ridiculous in any way. And the final boss, I like that they got rid of Dracula's centipede and they went with like ultimate Dracula. Like Dracula has so many forms, it's kind of crazy at this point. Much better final boss there. In terms of the whole story about, I believe his name is like what's his name? Cornell. Cornell's his name. He's going to this castle to like rescue his sister, and he's part werewolf, and then he's got like a brother friend who's also a werewolf and hates him and is jealous. And it's your typical redemption arc. He's kind of a badass, and at the end he's like, I was just doing this because I love everyone. And anyways, it's old, it's used, but I wasn't expecting much from this game, honestly. It's an old game that for its time, I think was a really good game. I think it was very different. I don't know, for the Castlevania audience, I can imagine this being quite a niche and divisive game because it is the first time that it went 3D, and this is when Castlevania was starting to experiment with its identity. We were going from the 2D really hard old school Castlevania formula, and then it kind of mutated and turned into what we now call the Metroidvania of exploring and finding upgrades. And now you had this third branch, which was the 3D branch. And based on what I'm seeing just as an outsider looking back, there's not that many 3D Castlevania games. So I'm really curious to see what happened there. Like, this is the foundation of the 3D branch of Castlevanias. So I'm curious to see if it evolved, if it got better, if at one point they're just like, it doesn't work in 3D, give it up, nobody likes this. Like Legacy of Darkness is not a game I want to go back to, which is very different than, let's say, Rondo of Blood or Symphony of the Night. Those are games I would happily go back to. Like, they're classics, they play well, I have good memories with them. Legacy of Darkness, it's just old. It's like driving a rusty car. It's just not really that interesting. It's worth experiencing, but otherwise it's not that interesting. And in terms of saying much more than what I've already said in the Castlevania 64 diary, there is the whole Henry arc, which I found that was interesting, and I'll admit I did not play it properly. I played it a bit. So after you beat, what's interesting is, okay, you have 4 characters and 4 different stories, and you can't play that until you unlock them. So you have to beat the first story with Cornell, and then you can unlock Henry's story, which is a little boy you save when you're Cornell, and then he comes back to the castle to save a bunch of women, and he's actually all decked out in armor, and you actually have a gun, which I think is the first time you play as someone with a gun in the Castlevania franchise, which is pretty cool. But the whole point of returning to the castle as Henry, it's more of a, some people have called it a speed run, which I agree. You have 6 days, if I recall properly, to go through the entire castle, which kind of gives it that Metroidvania style gameplay, but it doesn't because it's not fun and you don't get upgrades. Anyways, you basically have to go through the entire castle searching for these women, and that's how you beat Henry's story, which is a very different formula to Castlevania. One of which I don't like because it is so damn stressful. Like 6 days is not a lot, and then you have the whole moon and sun cycle, and sometimes you have to cycle through the days, specifically in Cornell's story, which is something I absolutely hate. I wasted so much time in the second level simply because I didn't have the right moon or sun card, and I had to wait for literally the clock to go around. Back then, I remember it was a big deal to have the day-night cycle in video games. I don't know why. I don't know why. It's more realistic, but it sucks. It sucks to wait. I hated that. I wasted so much time waiting for the stupid sun and the stupid moon to come out because I didn't have cards at that time. It's before you meet the vendor that you can buy the cards from. Once you can buy the cards, it's a bit less of an issue. But geez, I hated that. Anyway, so back to Henry. I'm probably gonna have to go back and play it properly. But then when you after Henry, then you can play the original stories from Castlevania 64, which admittedly I also did not play because I was coming off fresh of Castlevania 64, and I did not want to go through all that again. I experienced what they want. I assume that Legacy of Darkness offers a little bit more polish off that, which is a welcome addition. I can't confirm it, but otherwise the new stuff that they bring into is pretty good. And overall, like I said, the bosses were my favorite part. And all I can say is I'm glad to go back to 2D games. I'm really excited because the next couple games are the Game Boy Advance series, which are all Metroidvanias. This is when we're digging into the Metroidvania era of Castlevania. I'm super excited for this. We're not going to touch a 3D Castlevania again until a PlayStation 2 title, which is a little ways away. Overall, though, great game for what it was at its time. Does it deserve the hate? I don't think so. Does it deserve a revisit? Unless you're really trying to get through the whole series, I don't think so either. So anyways, join me next time on the Castlevania Diaries as we go through the Game Boy Advance series, and I'm gonna be sharing my thoughts on those games. See you then.